rebonjour à tout le monde et nous allons recommencer. Je vais vous inviter à mettre votre oreillette, étant donné qu'on a des services d'interprétation et qu'il y a deux panélistes qui vont parler, vont s'exprimer en français. Alors, tous ceux et celles qui ont besoin d'interprétation, ne vous gênez pas pour l'installer tout de suite. Et puis, bien, je suis très heureuse de pouvoir vous accueillir, vous réaccueillir dans cette salle pour le troisième panel qui portera sur l'industrie et l'urbanisme propre. Et je vais vous aviser tout de suite que si jamais je disparais de la salle, c'est pas parce que j'ai pas envie d'être ici, c'est parce que j'ai une petite fille qui est ma patronne. Alors, ça se peut que je disparaisse, mais je devrais pouvoir rester jusqu'à la fin du panel. Alors, ceci étant dit, comme vous avez les biographies dans votre document, je ne vais pas lire les biographies, mais simplement présenter chacun des invités à tour de rôle pour qu'on puisse avoir plus de temps pour la discussion à la fin. Le premier panéliste, donc, qui va nous adresser la parole, c'est M. René Drolet, qui est consultant en environnement et en développement durable et qui parlera de l'importance de se doter de politiques publiques favorisant le développement de technologies propres. Il est aussi celui qui viendra nous parler un peu du rapport de la table nationale, la table ronde sur l'énergie et l'environnement, l'économie et l'environnement, pardon. Monsieur Drolet, à vous la parole.
Merci. Bonjour à tous. Premièrement, j'aimerais remercier les organisateurs de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui et je voudrais les féliciter de cette initiative-là. C'est vraiment une journée intéressante. Je pense que c'est une initiative qui mérite d'être soulignée. Oui, est-ce qu'il était on? OK. Est-ce que vous m'entendez mieux? OK. Being the first speaker after lunch is always interesting because that means I have to compete with digestive processes. So I'll try to keep you awakened, and to do so, I've decided I'm not going to use any slides. So you're going to have to focus and listen to what I'm going to try to say. And as a complicating factor, I'm going to do all of my remarks in French. So, but I'll be happy to answer questions in English at the end. Alors, on m'a demandé aujourd'hui de parler des politiques publiques. Quelles sont les politiques publiques qu'on devrait mettre en place, en fait, pour supporter les technologies propres, en fait, pour supporter un virage vers une société plus durable? Alors, c'est un sujet pour lequel on pourrait discuter pendant des heures. En 10 minutes, je vais juste effleurer certains aspects que je pense sont importants. Je vais me fier sur mon expérience personnelle en développement et analyse de politique publique et également plusieurs rapports qui ont été publiés dans les dernières années, autant au Canada qu'à l'étranger, par des think tanks et aussi par des groupes industriels. D'entrée de jeu, je pense que la plupart des experts s'entendent pour dire que le capital qui est nécessaire pour les investissements en technologie propre, ce capital-là, il est disponible. Et le potentiel d'innovation technologique, il est énorme. Mais ce qui est nécessaire et souvent ce qui manque, ce sont deux choses. Un leadership qui vient du niveau politique et deux, des politiques publiques crédibles et cohérentes. Donc, un ensemble de politiques publiques qui convergent vers un même objectif. Je vais dire quelques mots d'un rapport sur lequel j'ai eu la chance de participer alors que je travaillais à la table ronde nationale sur l'environnement et l'économie. En 2012, on a publié un rapport qui s'appelait « Framing the Future », qui s'intéressait à comment le Canada peut tirer parti des possibilités qui sont offertes par la transition vers une économie faible en carbone. C'est une transition qui s'opère présentement au niveau mondial et on a regardé comment le Canada pouvait se positionner là-dedans pour en tirer bénéfice. On a conclu à ce moment-là qu'il y avait 4 grands objectifs, en fait, des grandes catégories d'objectifs, des choses qu'on devrait favoriser au niveau des politiques publiques. Et donc, le premier objectif, c'est qu'il faut stimuler l'innovation. Bon, c'est une chose assez simple à dire. Comment on fait ça? Je pense que pour les gouvernements, il y a un rôle afin de développer des incitatifs qui vont permettre d'engendrer une demande pour les innovations. Donc, il y a un rôle pour les gouvernements au niveau de ça pour stimuler l'innovation. Il y a également des exemples. En fait, on peut mettre en place des grappes d'innovation. Une grappe dans le sens où on met en contact, en présence, tous les acteurs à l'intérieur de cet écosystème-là, si vous voulez. Donc, les innovateurs, les utilisateurs potentiels des innovations et les investisseurs. un peu comme une grappe industrielle, mais vraiment pour les technologies propres. Il y a des exemples qui fonctionnent très bien. Au Québec, depuis quelques années, il y a un groupe qui s'appelle Écotech Québec, la grappe des technologies propres, qui fait un travail très productif de ce côté-là. Donc ça permet également de stimuler l'innovation. Parce que souvent, les innovateurs, là où ils frappent un mur, c'est au niveau de la commercialisation. Alors, si on les met en contact avec les gens qui peuvent les aider là-dedans, c'est une bonne façon de stimuler l'innovation. Le deuxième objectif, c'est de mobiliser les investissements dans les infrastructures et dans les technologies. Et puis là, bien évidemment, il y a un rôle pour le secteur public, un rôle pour le secteur privé. Il y a des mesures gouvernementales qui pourraient être nécessaires, par exemple, pour assurer la participation des investisseurs en diminuant le risque, que ce soit le risque réel ou la perception du risque d'investir dans des technologies qui sont nouvelles. Je vais y revenir un peu plus tard là-dessus. Il y a aussi un rôle pour les institutions financières qui peuvent créer des nouveaux instruments de placement. On le voit là dans les capital ventures. Il y a un rôle de ce côté-là également. Le troisième objectif, c'est d'améliorer l'accès au marché. Ça peut se faire de différentes façons. Les gouvernements devraient s'impliquer dans l'élaboration de normes internationales, que ce soit ISO ou d'autres types de normes qui permettent ça va aider ensuite à commercialiser certaines technologies si il y a des normes qui sont développées pour ces nouvelles technologies-là. Mais au niveau domestique, les politiques en matière d'approvisionnement peuvent aider. Les gouvernements sont les plus grands acheteurs de biens et services, que ce soit les gouvernements provinciaux, le gouvernement fédéral. Les gouvernements achètent énormément de biens et de services. Alors, si dans l'attribution de contrats, par exemple, le gouvernement fédéral met des conditions pour favoriser les nouvelles technologies, bien, ça va aider à faire des projets aux innovateurs, par exemple, de démontrer la faisabilité de leur technologie et ça va ensuite aider à la commercialisation. Donc, et ça va diminuer la perception du risque pour les investisseurs parce qu'ils vont voir que les technologies fonctionnent. Donc, il y a des choses à faire de ce côté-là. Et finalement, le quatrième objectif qu'on avait identifié, c'était de favoriser le perfectionnement des talents et des compétences. Autrement dit, les stratégies de création d'emplois et de perfectionnement des compétences doivent être en évolution et ils doivent être liés aux politiques en matière d'énergie, aux politiques en matière d'innovation, etc. Donc, il y a éviter que ça soit complètement déconnecté l'une de l'autre. Évidemment, pour atteindre tous ces objectifs-là, il y a plusieurs conditions qui sont essentielles. Il y a des choses qui ont été mentionnées déjà ce matin, par exemple, une tarification du carbone, qui a un prix sur le carbone qui peut aider en favorisant, en influençant le marché. Également, l'équité, on a parlé des subventions qui sont accordées aux combustibles fossiles par rapport aux subventions accordées aux énergies renouvelables. Donc, ce sont des conditions, des choses qu'il faudrait regarder. Mais je vais m'attarder pour le reste de ma présentation sur une autre condition qui est la cohérence des politiques publiques. C'est quelque chose qui a été identifié, qui est très important, entre autres, pour l'industrie, évidemment. Le Conseil canadien des chefs d'entreprise a publié, je pense c'était en 2010, un rapport qui s'intéressait à comment le Canada peut devenir un leader en termes d'innovation environnementale et au niveau de l'énergie. Et une des choses, ce rapport-là parlait de l'importance d'éviter des politiques contradictoires, donc des politiques gouvernementales qui travaillent l'une contre l'autre sans que ce soit prévu à la base. Et on parlait donc d'une cohérence entre les politiques d'innovation et les politiques technologiques. C'est un sujet qui est mentionné souvent, c'est assez facile à comprendre. Maintenant, beaucoup plus difficile à réaliser. Comment on évite que les politiques soient contradictoires? En fait, la cohérence, on peut la rechercher entre les différents paliers de gouvernement, que ce soit les politiques fédérales, provinciales, municipales, et espérer que ça travaille ensemble. Et on a des bons exemples où ça fonctionne. Quand on parle d'un sujet commun, par exemple, les politiques en matière d'infrastructure, souvent on a une collaboration et des politiques des trois paliers de gouvernement qui travaillent vers des objectifs communs. On a la même chose au Canada sur la qualité de l'air, où les provinces et les fédérales ont travaillé pendant des années par le biais du Conseil canadien des ministres de l'Environnement pour développer des politiques qui convergent vers un même objectif. Curieusement, là où ça bat de l'aile souvent, c'est à l'intérieur d'un même niveau de gouvernement. Donc, à l'intérieur, par exemple, d'un gouvernement provincial, on a souvent des politiques qui ont des effets néfastes sur d'autres politiques. Par exemple, ça peut être des politiques de transport versus les politiques d'aménagement du territoire. Ça peut être les politiques de lutte contre les changements climatiques et les politiques de gestion des matières résiduelles. Parfois, il y a des effets, parce que ces politiques-là sont développées un peu en silo à l'intérieur des gouvernements, il y a des effets imprévus qui font qu'une politique empêche d'atteindre les objectifs d'une autre. On pourra en parler plus lors des questions. Il y a des exemples assez concrets qu'on voit de ce côté-là. Maintenant, comment on peut essayer d'intégrer les politiques de meilleure façon? Évidemment, on peut travailler, je pense que l'industrie le fait beaucoup, les groupes industriels travaillent avec les fonctionnaires des différents niveaux de gouvernement pour essayer de, au moins, rendre les fonctionnaires conscients de ce problème-là. Et c'est des efforts qui doivent continuer, mais on est tous, moi, personnellement, j'ai travaillé 20 ans au gouvernement fédéral et je sais que les bureaucraties, c'est des organisations qui sont très, très grandes et le changement est très, très lent. Alors, comment on peut accélérer ce changement-là? La façon, c'est probablement en passant par le politique, parce que la fonction publique répond aux besoins et aux demandes du gouvernement en place. Donc, on peut s'attarder un peu au niveau de comment les décisions sont prises par les gouvernements, quelle est la gouvernance qui permettrait de mieux intégrer les politiques. Et je vais donner un exemple. Ça semble évident que c'est connu. Les politiciens reconnaissent ce problème-là. Dernièrement, je m'amusais à regarder, vous savez, en Ontario, la première ministre a décidé de rendre publiques les lettres de mandat pour tous ses ministres. Et je me suis amusé à regarder quelques-unes de ces lettres-là, en particulier la lettre de mandat de Glenn Murray, le ministre de l'Environnement et des Changements climatiques. Et à plusieurs endroits, dans le mandat donc, qui vient de la première ministre, elle lui demande de travailler avec ses collègues ministres de l'Énergie, ministre des Transports, ministre des Affaires municipales, etc. Donc, il y a une reconnaissance que les politiques doivent être développées, les programmes doivent s'enligner. Maintenant, est-ce que c'est suffisant? Probablement pas, mais c'est un point de départ. Je vais donner un autre exemple pour terminer avec ça, sur une situation qu'on observe présentement en Alberta. Le nouveau premier ministre, M. Jim Prentice. Comme vous le savez, M. Prentice a été ministre fédéral de l'Environnement pendant quelques années. Et bon, je pense que plusieurs vont être d'accord avec moi que la performance de M. Prentice comme ministre de l'Environnement était un peu décevante, pour rester poli. Mais il semble qu'il y a peut-être des points positifs, des choses qu'il a appris de cette expérience-là. J'ai vu, il y a 2 semaines, quand il a annoncé son cabinet en Alberta, ce que j'ai trouvé intéressant, c'est de regarder, vous savez comment les décisions se prennent, les ministres travaillent en comité. Il y a les comités ministériels et les cabinet committees. Et je regardais la composition et le comité le plus important, c'est souvent le comité du Conseil du Trésor, donc le Treasury Board. Et ce que j'ai noté, c'est que M. Prentice a donné la présidence de ce comité-là à son ministre des Finances, ce qui est normal et attendu. Mais le vice-président du comité est le ministre de l'Environnement. Et j'ai trouvé ça intéressant parce que traditionnellement, autant au fédéral qu'au provincial, les ministres de l'Environnement sont souvent relégués à des rôles de second plan à l'intérieur des discussions entre ministres. Et là, on voit que le ministre de l'Environnement va peut-être avoir l'opportunité d'avoir un peu plus de pouvoir. Est-ce que ça va donner, au bout de la ligne, une meilleure intégration des politiques économiques et environnementales? Il est beaucoup trop tôt pour le dire, mais c'est un point que je trouve qui est encourageant et on va voir si ça permet d'avoir un meilleur alignement des politiques publiques. Je vais arrêter là pour l'instant.
Merci beaucoup, M. Drolet. Et puis, je vais prendre mes notes. J'ai oublié de rappeler à tout le monde qu'on dispose de 10 minutes chacun et je sais que c'est difficile parce que vous avez beaucoup de choses à dire et selon votre expertise aussi qui est très, très précieuse. Alors, on retient la cohérence des politiques publiques, le travail d'équipe et non pas en silo. Maintenant, nous allons accueillir M. Peter Denton, qui est représentant du programme des Nations Unies pour justement l'environnement. Donc, il va nous parler du rôle de la société civile dans le domaine des industries propres et dans le contexte international de négociation aussi pour le climat. Monsieur Denton, merci beaucoup. Et le podium est à vous.
Merci Anne. Bonjour à tous. I'm a civil society representative. And what that means at UN Fora is that you tend to come in and no one knows what you're going to say or about what. And your role is to provide, I think, a difference in perspective. Not to be antagonist, but a difference in perspective. So I've taken that to heart today. So before addressing the subject of our session, I want to set out a series of statements as a foundation for my comments. First, climate change is a global issue with specific local causes and implications. Anyone who still thinks human activity has not seriously damaged planetary ecology simply has not been paying attention. Traveling off-road in a remote part of Kenya this past summer, I noticed Maasai huts along the way were not topped with the traditional conical roof. When I asked why, my Maasai friend raised one eyebrow and said, "Climate change, of course. We have not had enough rain for several years to make the long grasses grow." Second, sustainability is not primarily a scientific or technological problem. It is a social and cultural problem. We already have all the science and technology we need to solve the ecological problems we face. We know what needs to be done. We simply don't choose to do it. Sustainability requires better choices, not better tools. Third, making better choices toward a sustainable future requires a dynamic understanding of all of the interrelated systems involved. This means the static, three-legged stool model of sustainability, environment, society, and economy is not only fundamentally wrong, but inherently dangerous as a guide to the choices we need to make. We risk being in the absurd position of deciding we can't afford to create a future in which people are able to survive. Fourth and finally, without the active participation and engagement of civil society in the, in the planning, delivery, and operation of initiatives aimed at sustainable development, these initiatives will all certainly fail. This makes the citizens of any country not merely appendages to the decision-making of governments and industry, but essential stakeholders and partners without whose involvement any efforts to improve sustainability outcomes will be ultimately unsuccessful. So setting these statements out as a foundation, and I'd be happy to have conversation about any of them, I want to turn to the subject of sustainable industries and urban centers and offer some observations, beginning with the obvious statement that cities are places where people live. Particularly, they are places that people call home, and this distinction is important. If the residents of any community regard it as transitional housing, as a step along the way to somewhere else, they are not as emotionally invested in making changes that could prove costly or personally inconvenient. If you regard some place as home, wherever and whatever it may be, there is an inherent emotional investment toward its care, development, and preservation in the longer term. A sense of home is attached to personal and social identity, to community, to a place, however grim, where everybody knows your name. Efforts toward clean energy and sustainable industry will only work if they are rooted within local communities in which citizens have a stake not just for the moment, but also for the future. Initiatives situated somewhere else that require local changes in behavior will therefore not have much community support. Efforts to enhance local identity, to develop local communities, to foster a sense of civic pride, therefore may create precisely the kind of circumstance in which sustainability initiatives can take root and grow. So we need to see efforts to improve sustainability in sectors like energy and industry within the context of first enhancing the identification of citizens with the place they call home. A company with a wise corporate social responsibility profile, therefore, would deliberately link sustainability initiatives with long-term social engagement in the community instead of merely cashing in their chips for a few annual charity pictures in the local newspaper. Second, with the possible exception of Vancouver, urban planning in Canadian cities with respect to sustainability is largely a disaster if it happens at all. We need to put absolute boundaries on urban development, both to protect arable land and to encourage the urban density that a sustainable urban infrastructure requires. There is too great a temptation to plant that one last crop of concrete instead of addressing the issues of urban redevelopment that are much messier and more complicated than turning soybeans into subdivisions. Without population density, especially in the core, mass transportation systems are too costly for the volume of potential traffic, given the size of the system required to service a diffuse population. Huge single-family dwellings with 3 or 4 car garages and 4 baths occupied by 2.3 people, located 40 minutes away by car in rush hour from work or school, will never be a sustainable urban design from any standpoint, especially in terms of energy efficiency. And of course, the main thing you need for population density is more people. And this is my third observation. Our refugee and immigration policies have been utterly inadequate since the Laurier administration. The gap between the numbers of newcomers we land and the ones we need to land is growing almost exponentially as the baby boomers retire and there are not enough younger people to take their places. And nor is this a problem solved by raising the retirement age. In a climate-threatened world, millions more people will be displaced in the near future than we see at the moment. As Canadians, we live in the most sparsely populated area of the world after Antarctica, so we have space to take in a few more people. Eliminating the tangle of quotas and bureaucracy that stretch wait times for family reunification would bring in thousands every year with ties to family and thus to community that would strengthen the fabric of our society and make it more sustainable. And fourth, cities are levers of change precisely because they are the places that increasing numbers of people call home. Change how people live together in cities, so the story goes, and you will change things toward a more sustainable future. But in Canada, it would be a serious mistake to think urban centres only means cities, even if that is where the bulk of the Canadian population lives. In the context of the country as a whole, urban centres are small islands in the midst of a vast landscape. It is more accurate to see urban centres of whatever size as part of larger social, cultural, and economic watersheds. Our understanding of the importance of such urban centres should be driven by location and role rather than by size or population. The parallel may be made between the watersheds of such urban centres and the physical watersheds within which we need to consider the ecological contexts of human activities, because both require us to understand whole systems first and foremost. In a climate-changed world, it is not our cities that will mark Canada's most significant contribution to a sustainable future, but our landscape, the rivers and lakes, the agricultural lands, the boreal and other forests. Our urban centers should be aimed at enabling and supporting the land around them, reversing the flow of energy and resources from the land to the city. This is a crucially important point for Canada as we head toward 2050. Other countries will point toward their cities as the places where the battle for a sustainable future will be won. But in Canada, it will be the reverse. The more we focus on our urban centers to the detriment of the countryside around them, the less of a contribution we will make to the sustainable future of our planet. We need to reverse our focus to find ways to support and redevelop the small communities that are disappearing from the prairies, for example, returning them to their historic roles as agricultural centers. And this means dealing with the social and cultural realities of rural and small town life across the Canadian landscape. Enhance the life of these small communities, and you make it possible for people to once again survive on the farm. Make them places where newcomers to Canada are given the opportunities to find a new home, just as Western Canada was settled by wave upon wave of immigrants for the first half of the last century. Make intentional the possibilities of where people can live and how they can make a living, and find ways to do this without further endangering the local ecosystems. This would change the game in Canada, wouldn't it? And that's what we need to do if we want a different future than the one that is otherwise going to confront us. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, M. Denton, et on retient de faire des meilleurs choix pour qui s'enracinent dans des communautés à long terme et non pas à court terme. Également les politiques d'immigration qui sont alignées sur le changement climatique aussi global. Alors, merci beaucoup. Et puis, nous allons accueillir notre troisième panéliste, Renée Gratton, qui est la présidente de RG Intégration et fondatrice du Conseil d'initiative des ressources en construction, qui va nous parler de la question des bâtiments durables et de la récupération et de la réutilisation des déchets industriels. Merci, Madame Gratton.
Merci à vous et merci aussi de l'initiative que vous avez prise. Alors, moi, je vais vous parler d'un projet qui me tient grandement à cœur, qu'on appelle Mission 2030. Donc, Mission 2030, c'est un appel à l'action pour net zéro construction, rénovation, démolition par l'année 2030. C'est un projet que j'ai initié en 2011, qui est basé sur les principes fondamentaux de la gestion de changement. C'est aussi un premier pas. Donc, ce n'est pas parfait, mais si on ne peut pas engager les gens dans une discussion, on ne pourra certainement pas les changer. Donc, c'est le but essentiel de Mission 2030. C'est tout simplement sur réduire, réutiliser, recycler. Et on se débat toujours sur la question récupérer pour l'énergie. On l'a inclus, ceci dit, on ne veut pas que ce principe empêche une progression responsable et des décisions responsables dans le procès. Par contre, je reviens, puis c'est important de dire qu'il faut engager avant de pouvoir faire quoi que ce soit. Je tiens aussi à dire que Mission 2030, c'est un projet inspiré, espérément aussi inspirant, qui en partie vient d'une mission, une opération coopérative de la Deuxième Grande Guerre mondiale, du débarquement de Normandie, qui s'appelle Mulberry Harbor, donc le port Mulberry. Mais c'est aussi un support à un programme qui s'appelle Architecture 2030. Donc, Architecture 2030, c'est un programme qui est initié par un architecte Ed Mazria des États-Unis qui a appelé à l'appel toute la communauté architecturale à designer et rénover les bâtiments pour que par l'année 2030, les bâtiments neufs soient neutres en émissions, en carbone. Donc, pourquoi Mission 2030 est important? Ben, c'est beau, Architecture 2030, mais si on design le projet parfait avec des énergies renouvelables, avec toute la technologie, ça reste encore juste un design. C'est encore pas un projet bâti de façon efficace. Et puis, ce qu'on se rend compte, c'est que c'est très difficile de suivre entièrement la chaîne des matériaux qui sont échangés. On peut aller couper un bloc en Italie, on peut l'envoyer au Portugal pour faire traiter en tuiles. Ensuite, on l'envoie aux États-Unis pour un autre processus. On l'empacte, on l'envoie un peu partout. Puis finalement, tous les matériaux non résidentiels, et surtout au Canada, ça fait partie du North American Free Trade Agreement. Excusez mon franglais. Mais c'est très difficile de suivre la chaîne des matériaux. Et puis, pour chaque tonne qu'on retrouve dans les sites d'enfouissement, essentiellement, c'est non seulement des ressources perdues, c'est de l'eau qui est gaspillée, c'est de l'énergie qui est gaspillée, puis c'est de l'argent gaspillé. Alors, je pourrais faire une grande liste de pourquoi Mission 2030 est important, mais la raison pourquoi on a initié en 2011 et puis finalement lancé en 2013, c'est qu'on a un plan qui s'appelle le Plan d'action du Canada et qui a des règles quand vous achetez une télé ou la peinture, il y a une ligne qui s'appelle... donc, cette ligne-là, c'est pour la responsabilisation élargie des fabricants, Extended Producer Responsibility. Et puis, c'est pour l'industrie de la construction, rénovation, bâtiment, pour plusieurs matériaux. On aura ça, toutes les provinces devront avoir une politique vis-à-vis ceci par l'année 2017. Le problème, c'est que c'était très mal communiqué. L'industrie est à peine... pardon, mon français. I'm going to switch to English because it's a little easier. Sorry about that. So the industry is really not aware of what is going on, and what is happening is we are falling behind in terms of innovations, in terms of education, of continuing educations for the professionals. And so what is then happening is these legislation are going to hurt us economically because our companies are just not ready for it. So we have to put together a plan that works for everybody. We need those laws. They are absolutely critical, but we need them to be effective. We don't, laws are expensive, legislations are expensive, and they are also very hard to implement. This is one of the largest industry in the world, as well as in Canada, and we need to have the infrastructure. It's one thing to put a policy in place, but you have to have the infrastructure in place to deal with it. So we want to deal with the challenges, but as well as turn those into opportunities. The other thing that is happening too is that a lot of the non-residential waste that is being freely traded is ending up near the poor, not just the developing countries, but north of Canada. So we heard about the rights to the Indigenous. If you go in the Northern Territories, just look up the landfills conditions in the Northern Territories, it is like a third world country. Half the people do not have the most fundamental waste management infrastructure in place, and that includes in Canada. And there's something really wrong about, I don't want the waste here, so I'm going to send it over the border for a fraction of the tipping fee. So there's definitely a social issue there. However, Mission 2030, it's fairly simplistic and it has a long way to go. We can do a fair bit with basic education to the industry. We'll probably progress to a diversion of 70% by 2015. We can probably do really well, but it's that last percentage, whatever that is, in the last 5 years that's going to be really, really challenging. It also, we're getting now to the point that we have so many chemicals in our products that what goes in must come out. And if we send it to recycling, it may very well contaminate the recycling materials. So we have a much deeper issue. We also have to, we cannot have a complete conversation until we talk about the embodied energy, the energy that it takes to extract the material, to transport it, to install it, to maintain it. We cannot have this conversation without waste to energy. This is what shocked me in going from endless green building conferences, sustainable building conferences, to going to the World Waste Congress in 2012. And the president said, there is no energy crisis. We have so much waste that all we have to do is just use the waste. And by the way, did you know that Canadians waste more per capita than any OECD countries? And then, of course, the OECD countries generate more waste collectively than all of the other countries. So it's really, really critical that we have a complete, and then this morning there was the discussion of having a coordinated conversation. So these laws that are going to come from province to province, we could have as many policies for extended producer responsibility as we have provinces. It could be different when we want to trade over the border. So we not only need to have a very coordinated policy, we have to have a complete policy and discussion. So how do we do that? Well, our first step was Mission 2030. The next thing that we are going to start talking about for the Construction Resource Initiatives Council that I proudly founded is the stewardship program, the Mission 2030 stewardship program. We actually started by calling it the Transformation Project, kind of like the butterfly effect. You know, if a small action here can have a really big reaction much further, and you may not see and understand the whole thing, and it's not linear, and it doesn't always make sense. And things will change from here to 2030. Governments will change, and technologies and products and people will change, mentality will change. But what will not change is that we're never sure of anything. There's always going to be unknown. So all we know is that we can do the best, but we can do better when we have more minds at the table, essentially. A body of knowledge and a body that supports itself and that works together. The two of the largest construction companies in Canada, Elliston and PCL, got together at the recent Canada Green Building Council. They shared the cost of an award. You know, there's a lot that can be done. I look at the Canadian Precast Concrete Institute. They are doing they will be the first association to put together a life cycle sustainable plant program. They put to their board of directors, they signed Mission 2030 as soon as it was out. I have to say it. We have friends here from Brookfield Johnson Control, a very large company and real estate property management company. They signed Mission 2030. I often get asked, you know, is it even possible? Because people get so caught on that word zero. I mean, it's kind of like construction. A 2x4 is not really a 2x4. But it's not fun to call it 1 5/8 by 3 3/4. Okay? And I will also say that we have we're doing much better as Canadian on terms of what we come out of our house, on terms of what we recycle. But the 2/3 of the waste stream is actually the industrial, commercial, institutional, and that is getting worse. So the question is not, you know, is it possible or not? The question is, why are we not even starting? How much more do we need? Do we need another mountain of waste? So it's the system that we have to change. It's the whole bidding process. It's the whole system. It's not just designers. It's a political system. It's the design principles, construction, operations, maintenance, waste management, and so on. I do want to finish with a few inspirational words by your leader, Jack Layton, who inspired so many of us. And that is, don't let them tell you that it can't be done. You know, I'm often told, you're crazy. But the reality is I much rather sleep at night thinking that I might be crazy, but at least I'm doing something about it, and I'm trying, than in 2030 watching my stepchildren and my niece and saying, I really should have tried. So it's up to us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Gratton. Et effectivement, c'est vraiment à nous de faire en sorte que ça change. J'espère que votre projet de mission 2030 va pouvoir inspirer justement le nouveau gouvernement, parce que vous avez dit que ça allait changer. J'espère que vous avez une bonne boule de cristal et que ce sera un gouvernement NPD plus progressiste qui voudra faire en sorte qu'il y ait des lois pour justement que ça soit plus efficace au niveau de l'industrie. Et maintenant, notre quatrième panéliste, c'est M. Tim Gray, qui est le directeur exécutif d'Environmental Defense et qui va nous parler des outils qu'offre le marché économique pour développer de façon durable la forêt et comment certifier de façon environnementale. Merci.
Merci, Anne. Hi, everybody. I'm going to switch gears quite strongly in the industry direction. Environmental defense, in addition to engaging the public around policy reform related to land use and climate change and energy use, we do a lot of direct government engagement and also a lot of industry engagement, which tends to be quieter, take a long time, and involve intense negotiation that is interest-based. And I actually have had a fair amount of experience with this, not just in environmental defense, but also in jobs that I've had previously. And that experience goes back 20 years now, and I really think that there's things to be learned from this that are incredibly valuable at a time in society's conversation where we're talking about finally getting to a point where we are no longer seeing the environment as something that we can just dump our byproducts in, but that we actually have to internalize the cost of environmental services into the profit-making machine that we have in our society. And I think certification can offer some important lessons about how that can be possible, how industry can thrive in that environment, and how government can contribute to creating the conditions that make the development of these marketplace mechanisms more possible. So today, I just wanted, first slide, please. I just wanted to work through some examples of where third-party certification has been developed. I'll start in forest, but then talk a little bit more about some more recent developments in that area. Some of the key attributes and advantages of certification systems that actually work. And then lastly, because of the forum that we're in today, what the role is for governments in that, because quite often people forget that there is an important place for government in these market mechanisms that are independently developed. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with Forest Stewardship Council. It's a system that I've been involved with for about 20 years, and therefore know a little bit about how it's evolved and how it's worked and how it hasn't. And so I'll go through that first. Next slide. It was launched in Toronto in 1994. This is a global system now, and I'll give you some sense of that a little later. But it was actually started by Canadians. First meeting was at the Canada Life Building in downtown Toronto in 1994. Next slide. And this was the idea that people organized around was the idea that companies could actually differentiate themselves in the marketplace by competing on environmental performance. That instead of just competing for lowest costs, lowest labor costs, access to markets, that they could actually change their behavior in terms of how they employed people and how they conducted their business, and in particular, how they carried out their forest practices in the case of forest companies, and they actually could compete on that basis. The NGOs that were involved in this, and I was one of them, my organization was one of them, turned to this because of a frustration with the pace and scale of change around regulatory and policy frameworks in the forest sector. If you remember back to some of the forestry battles in the 1990s, Temagami in Ontario, Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, it's not a surprise to any of you who work in politics that there was a significant stranglehold on effective policy change in the regulatory environment because of the power, the political power of the existing institutional structures around the forest industry. And it made it very difficult for politicians to act in a progressive way. So the environmental community looked to go around that block that existed and went directly to the marketplace. Part of that was in the form, of course, of market boycotts, in particular companies that were operating in those places that were very contentious were boycotted in the marketplace. But that's the stick side of it. What's the carrot? And FSC was very much developed as the carrot. The companies that could meet higher performance standards would have preferential access to markets and hopefully be able to translate that into improved performance around protected areas, forest practices, and as a result would have market access that the companies that did not meet those criteria would be deprived of. So some of the benefits. Next slide, please. These are some of the key features that were designed into FSC, and I believe it's actually addressed this quite well. Conservation of biological diversity and habitat. This was at the very top of the concerns from the environmental community. Protection of First Nation rights, a particularly important issue in Canada, where either places that are treated or places that are not treated is actually having meaningful collaboration and consultation with First Nation communities as part of the development of forest management plans. Transparency and independent third-party verification that the practice changes that are being required are actually occurring on the ground. And then last, and most importantly to the industry players, having market access and worldwide credibility. Now, FSC started in Canada, but now, of course, is global. It's based in Bonn, is the head office. There's millions and millions of hectares certified around the world. It is a very successful system. Next slide, please. You can get a sense of the growth of FSC. It started out very small, and in the early days, it was dismissed as a significant factor in the forest marketplace, forest product marketplace by major industry. They saw it as something that was set up for the average horse logger outside of Vernon, so not much of a threat in the marketplace because of the lack of volume. But as the market pressure, market pull for certified products began to increase, you saw a rapid uptake in the number of larger industrial players that were willing to change their practices to achieve this certification. And now you can see we're upwards towards 55, 57 million hectares of certified land in Canada, and much more, of course, on a global scale. Next, please. In addition to the areas certified, we have 960 chain of custody certificates. So these are the proof that the wood is actually coming from places where the forest itself is certified, and 75 forest management certificates. So these are the actual certificates that companies hold that show that they're managing the forest under the FSC brand. Next, please. Just a snapshot of one province, just across the river here in Quebec. A significant amount of the forested land, both public and private in Quebec, is certified, and that number has over doubled. Next slide, please. I think it'll actually show you. We reached a peak of 60 million in 2013. You can see the rapid growth there, tripling. There's been a slight diminishment there too, which I think is important. Next slide, please. I think part of the credibility of any system is whether or not you can actually lose your certification. A lot of people have been very concerned. Resolute Forest Products has lost a few of its certificates in Quebec, and a lot of people have been very concerned about what does that say about the future of the system. I actually think it says very good things about the system, in that if you don't meet the performance requirements, you could actually lose your certificate and then be deprived of that market access. So I think this is good news. Next slide, please. On the positive side, from the industry perspective, in the 2008 recession, Tembec in particular, another Quebec-based company, they were very clear that they believed that their survival during that downturn was totally a result of them being FSC certified and maintaining their preferential ability to sell their wood preferentially to Home Depot, the largest lumber buyer in North America, and it kept them solvent. Next, please. FSC is the largest, probably most well-known certification system on the planet. But as a result, there's a growing move for other industries and other civil society players to encourage the development of these systems in other areas. The Marine Stewardship Council is now underway. Our organization is involved with an initiative that's been underway at the negotiation stage for the last couple of years called the Cornerstone Standards Council. This is with the aggregate industry, some of the big players like Lafarge and Holcim. We're in the process of developing a standard which we hope we're going to finally land and be able to launch. There's new initiatives in the mining sector, and of course some of the more well-known ones around sustainable trade and coffee and things as well. So there's an incredible growth in this area, and the civil society interest in this really is around what I think most of us see as failure of government to act and to lead on these things, and so going to the marketplace instead. Next slide, please. So what are some of the advantages? I think I've mentioned that from our perspective, this is a civil society solution to an inability to get around the political roadblocks quite often that are very effectively thrown up by institutionalized power coming from major industries. In particular, these are effective in the Canadian context with large export industries such as the forest industry, because although the political power of the forest industry in the 90s here was overwhelming, 85% of the products were sold outside of our borders. Therefore, changing the dynamic in the marketplace was very effective at changing the willingness of industry to negotiate. It helps to internalize costs. You know, looking at it from the perspective of a responsible industry that wants to make change, it's a way of actually quantifying and pricing the cost of changing your practices. What we found in the forestry context is about 15 to 20% drop in annual allowable cut was required to meet the requirements of this certification system. So that was to establish protected areas, to move away from clear cutting as the dominant practice, establish stream buffers, make space for community forestry, et cetera. So that was sort of the hit, and it was actually able to quantify it and then know what that cost was. And it was real, and it was necessary to achieve the certification. Increases profit and sustainability. I think you know, the macro level narrative from Tembek about being able to access those markets, maintain profits, and actually sustain the business through lean times is a good indication of that. And I think for government and for industry, that it actually reduces regulatory burden, and probably more importantly, I think for industry, allows them to sit down with the main players that they're interacting with in the case of forestry in the landscape, or similar, I guess, with the aggregate industry, and actually spend concerted time developing a framework around how they're going to operate their businesses, where they're going to operate, how they're going to operate, how they're going to incorporate the communities that live within their areas they're operating, how they're going to address the environment, and do that outside of a regulatory environment, but then perhaps take it back into that to have that adopted. So I think it actually provides a forum for industry to have those conversations in a way that sometimes are more difficult, even in the regulatory environment for them. And then for civil society, for my organization and others, we actually get to bring the power that we've built up in terms of public pressure or market access and bring that to the table directly. And we then have an ability to consciously and continuously be thinking back, like, you know, what's our power base? How much can we get in this conversation to move the yardsticks forward? And we're not outgunned by a policy deadlock between institutionalized bureaucracies and powerful industries, because we come to the table with our own power, so it's much more attractive to us. And last slide. Roles for government, because many of you here are in government, and what does this do for you? Is this a threat to the power of government, or could it be used to actually reduce the work of government and help solve problems that government otherwise has a hard time solving themselves? And this is really important. In the certification world, my experience quite often has been is that politicians like certification because it actually helps bring forward solutions from multi-parties. Bureaucracies hate certification because they feel it's their job to trade off between interest groups, so they feel threatened by it. But politicians quite often welcome the solutions being brought forward. So, you know, what are some of the things that government can do, especially at a political level, to enable these systems to work more effectively. One clearly is to have governments preferentially favor products that are coming out of these certification schemes. Governments are huge buyers of products, everything from wood to chemicals. They can use these systems to help them set the regulatory or policy bar. Look to the outcomes of discussions around certifications to where you want your regulatory regime to go. Pardon? You want me to stop before I finish the slides?
Just if you can make
I have 3 bullets left, so. Science liaison, there's a huge role between the science people who work in government and industry to work together with the people who are working on the certification system. Look to the outcomes of these things, again, for focused policy input. And I think for like Canada or a province is that certification systems operating in your jurisdiction, you can actually look to them as a place where the branding coming from products that are coming out of your jurisdiction as being a place to enhance the branding of that jurisdiction, leading to more jobs and more investment. Thanks a lot. Look forward to your questions.
Alors, merci, Monsieur Gray. Je suis désolée de devoir interrompre pour le temps. J'essaie d'être le plus juste possible avec tous les panélistes. Et donc, oui, je pense que pour l'industrie, d'avoir une certification, ça serait très utile pour donner justement, favoriser les projets qui ont des critères, qui respectent des critères d'environnement, de développement durable. Et maintenant, la parole est à vous. Vous pouvez vous déplacer vers les micros. On a environ un petit peu moins que 30 minutes à pouvoir vous accorder pour que vous puissiez poser des questions à nos panélistes, à nos experts. Je vous demanderai de vous nommer votre organisation si vous en représentez une et d'être le plus bref possible dans vos questions pour qu'on puisse en avoir plusieurs. Mais comme j'en vois juste 2 qui s'élèvent, j'espère qu'il y en a d'autres qui vont vouloir aller au micro. Vous pouvez y aller. Monsieur au micro 51.
Merci. My name's Roger Peters. I'm with the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. I'd like to support Peter Denton's view that the move to a kind of clean economy has to be rooted in local ownership and participation. I think there's a lot of writing now these days that this will also be the only way that we're going to address the inequality issue and also some of the other issues that are more kind of social economic than environmental. Our co-op here in Ottawa and other co-ops across Ontario have leveraged about close to $10 million into renewable energy projects across Ontario. We've been struck by the real interest that members that we have are willing to switch their investments from RRSPs in the conventional market into local ownership. And we've close to, of the $2 million we've raised here in Ottawa, about 800,000 of that is people switching their RRSPs into solar energy shares in our co-op. So I think this is proof that I think it's the term used, I think internationally, is the social economy. And I think unless we grow that social economy as part of what we're doing, we're not going to achieve the sustainable and resilience that we want in the economy. So I'd ask the panelists, what role do you see the federal government having in trying to encourage the growth of that social economy, particularly in the clean energy area?
Merci. Monsieur Denton, si vous voulez commencer.
Thank you for the question. My arguments with friends in government in Manitoba is that the government's role is to stay it out. Governments can certainly make a mess of things. What remains to be seen is if government policy can actually lead to a sustainable future. So there's lots of evidence on the one side, the jury's still out on the other. Because I think what is really at the core of this is the necessity for individual citizens to make up their mind to live differently, to make better choices today than they did yesterday. So no amount of legislation, however coercive, in any society on the planet can force us to do that. On the other hand, if we choose to do things differently and make different choices, I would argue that no government, however coercive, can stop us. But the real key is that local community and the choices that individuals make. And the more we remove that decision point from the individuals, the less likely we are to see any kind of a significant change at all.
I'd like to add, I think there is a role in government. I don't think it's in deciding what technology is, because we can't get rid of them. However, so many dollars have been cut from research, and that has put us last on the OECD countries in terms of innovation. We know that according to the Conference Board of Canada, Canada does well, scores well in terms of education. But when you look at the higher level of education, we're actually not doing well at all. And also in terms of, this is a massive period of change. So this industry, the construction and building design industry, is a very old industry. It's set in habits. They have very high risks and liabilities, so to step outside their comfort zone without really knowing what it means to them as a professional, it's really uncomfortable. So we do need to put far more dollars in what we call learner-centered education for the trades, for the professionals. We need to have a much more focused program that is a sustainable education program, and the United Nations Environment Program has done that. There's a guideline for education for sustainable buildings and climate initiative. There's two other items that need to happen. One of them is, well, actually three, tools and support. I mean, if you're trying to build something, trying to do something new, you can't do it with the old tools. You need to have an effective communication. And you also need to, if this is going to be one of the largest change project that our generation will ever face, you wouldn't start a construction project without a project manager. So the role that the government has can help in managing what we know and can put in place. So change management is definitely very, very important.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres panélistes qui voulaient répondre à la question? Ça va? Oui. Monsieur Drolet?
Maybe just one comment. I'm not sure it's the role of the federal government, but in terms of governments in general, I mean, there's a role in education and capacity building for grassroots organizations. Could be financial capacity, technical capacity, but there is a need to have those organizations, and there's people involved in these kind of organizations know that people don't stay there. You have like people who volunteer their time, but there's a limit to what people can do, and they move to a better paying job. So there could be, through fiscal regime or something, there could be a role to help build capacity in those organizations.
Monsieur Denton?
Yeah, Renee, I really agree with that. That's a point that I wanted to make today. I'm involved with the United Nations Environment Program, and I was elected one of the 2 civil society representatives for the region of North America. I went to meetings in Nairobi in the Governing Council for the United Nations Environment Program in February 2013, and then back in March and then in June for the first United Nations Environment Assembly. I was the only Canadian representative of civil society present. Okay? The United Nations Environment Program has been handed the UN's mandate for the globe, the planet, and we didn't show up. I mean, the government representatives that were present were only allowed to be there because they were already in Nairobi in June. They decided security issues kept the rest home. And there we were, hardly anyone. And yet, as Canadians, we have a voice. We needed to be there, and it has been incredibly appreciated. I've been selected as one of 2 or 3, I don't know how many, we'll see when we get there, to go to Berlin in a couple of weeks to be involved in setting the parameters for GEO6, the next UNEP planetary survey. And there's lots of space at the table. We simply have to get there. So while I would like to point the finger at the government and say that the resources attached to this are not sufficient, and I would have to say that, I would say the bigger failure is Canadian civil society organizations who could be there and are not. And I think that that's a challenge that, in terms of capacity building, the government certainly could play a role. I did ask, is it possible to go along with the Canadian government delegation to these things? And I got just hilarity in response from the people I knew in the federal government. The thought that we would actually take people along who were non-aligned was not even contemplated. So capacity building for certain, that is a role rather than staying away.
Merci. J'avais une autre question au micro 62.
Yeah, I'm Will Dubitsky. I'll introduce myself a little differently this time. I've written a Canadian roadmap for a migration to a green economy based on models from around the world adapted to a Canadian context, and also based on my own Government of Canada experience after 37 years in the domain. I think I met all of the criteria that was in Mr. Drolet's presentation. But in looking at some of the basic things that we have to do, it strikes me that there are a few key things that we have to do. One starts with the subsidies for fossil fuels. The International Monetary Fund has estimated in 2011 US dollars that Canada spends $26.4 billion per year on fossil fuel subsidies. This includes the indirect subsidies such as for climate change and health and other related costs. This is something that's got to end. We've got to stop supporting the problem. The International Energy Agency has put it in a different angle and says at the world level, we're subsidizing fossil fuels at $110 a ton. Again, an example that we need to do things differently. Now, when you look at fossil fuels, you'll also find that non-conventional fossil fuels, such as those of the tar sands, cannot be supported by market prices. And there's a major divestment cycle that's going on with oil companies across the world to pull out of that. And so there's change happening, and where the change is happening is this migration to a green economy. And that's where the job growth is. We're talking about close to 400,000 jobs in the green sectors in Germany. That's bigger than the automobile industry. There are 300,000 jobs in the solar energy sector in China. We should be de-subsidizing the fossil fuel sectors and saying that the best economic development plan is actually a green economic development plan. This is happening all over the world, except in Canada, where we have two of our leaders, Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper, who are saying we are a resource economy. And the reality is, in the past 50 years, the price of raw resources has declined relative to finished goods. So I think we need a different economic model, stop subsidizing the problem, and go where the growth is, grow where there's high job creation. These are the basic ingredients for the migration to a green economy.
Merci. Juste avant que vous répondiez, est-ce que vous accepteriez qu'on prenne une deuxième question, qu'on prenne deux questions à la fois, puis que vous répondiez après? Parce que je vois qu'il y a de plus en plus de personnes au micro. Ah, OK. Donc, allez-y, M. Drolet.
I'll just have a very quick answer. I actually agree with most of what you said. I briefly referred to the subsidies when I talk about equity. It was more like fairness, I should use équité in French. That was intended to deal with that issue. I think it's an important one. It's one of the essential conditions that we put forward for in the roundtable report I referred to, and where we actually say that we need a low carbon growth plan in Canada. So that's another way of talking about the green economy. So I agree with most of what you said.
Donc, on va prendre une deuxième question, puis je vais laisser les panélistes répondre aux deux questions. Oui, allez-y, madame, au micro 51.
My name is Frances Deverell, and I'll address you this time with my hat on as the recent past president of the Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice. and also board member and builder of other volunteer organizations. I've noticed in the course of my life that it just seems like more and more things that used to belong to government are being thrown onto the voluntary sector, whether it's social services, food banks, you know, the list is endless. Now I'm being told regulatory services should be put onto the voluntary sector. Well, I personally know from hard slogging how hard it is to build, define, finance, and build a volunteer base and make a voluntary sector organization happen. So I really congratulate Mr. Gray for the success in that particular industry to make it worldwide and making it successful. I know in the fair trade industry it's operating a similar kind of process, but how are these organizations financed and what is the membership base of them? How do they work? And is it really better? I'm hearing all the panels say it's bureaucratic, jurisdictional, and regulatory wrangling that's stopping most of what we want to do. So maybe you're right. Maybe it should be this way. It's just, for me, it's tough to say the voluntary sector has to do it all.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions there. And I don't want to like take 15 minutes to answer them. I don't see what's gone on in certification, for example, as a replacement for regulation. And I think we have all kinds of circumstances where the public goes directly to political leaders to create the pressure for change. But in my experience, in many circumstances, the power that institutionalized companies, industries have mean that it's very difficult to achieve change through the political process that's necessary. So this is an alternative mechanism to do a workaround on that. And this is not even, like this is, from my experience, a generalized observation. You know, I've done government relations work with, you know, from the NDP to the Conservatives. And you know, in something like with the forest industry in the 90s in Canada, it didn't really matter what political party it was. None of them were willing to take the political hit necessary to force the forest industry to change. And if you wanted to overcome that, then you needed to go beyond that. And
who did it? Who were the people that made you? Like, who were your members?
The membership of our organizations? It was, yeah, like the FNC itself is made up of organizations from civil society and companies, right? Like the board of directors of that, both at a national scale and an international scale, is made up of the people who participate in it. But who created the momentum for the system to be developed was largely environmental organizations. And you know, the usual range that you'd be familiar with of organizations and their membership created the market demand for that by creating boycotts of companies that wouldn't participate in the system, essentially. So that's what created the momentum for it there. But I think when you have the result of something like that, which is basically a conflict going on in society, and then it gets resolved to some level by a process like this, the opportunity for government is to take the result of that and move that into the regulatory environment. And that's not going to solve everything. I mean, we have, as an organization, we work on everything from land use to toxins. And believe me, we turn to government first to get solutions and believe government should provide a leadership role there when we can make that possible. You know, the green belts in Ontario around Toronto is one of our big initiatives. We're very involved in toxics regulation, et cetera. But quite often, it's very difficult to get political leadership on some of these things. And it's not because all the politicians don't want to lead, it's because there's no political space for them to lead on it. You know, I think of something that we know we need in Canada right now, like a carbon tax, a price on carbon. I don't think any of the three major political parties are going to get out there in the next election and say we want a carbon tax, because it's like touching the third rail in terms of electability in Canada, or that's what the perception is. So, but we all know that we need one. But no, there's not a space there to do that yet. So what does civil society, who knows we need a carbon tax, do in that situation? You do a workaround. And certification is basically a workaround around failure of institutional systems around politics.
Est-ce qu'il y en a d'autres qui voulaient répondre aux questions? Ça va? OK. On va prendre 2 autres questions. Monsieur au numéro 62, au micro 62 plutôt. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm Ram Sahi. Currently, I'm with Carleton University in the Department of Economics. But before that, I was with the Ministry of Natural Resources, Government of Canada, for about 25, 30 years. So my questions are related to both backgrounds. I see a lot of passion for renewables and energy efficiency, and I fully support it. I support it on the bottom of the heart. But we also realize that there is quite a change in the trend in the energy markets. As you know, natural gas prices have fallen by 60% over the last 5 or 10 years. Coal prices are half of what used to be some 5-10 years ago, and perhaps oil could be the next. So I think there is a need to be careful in terms of should we flow against the tide, or should we do some kind of partnership with the petroleum industry, for example. And as you know, there was G20 meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, and there was a meeting of CEOs of financial institutions, petroleum institutions, and other kind of institutions. And those CEOs are very much talking about sustainable development, green energy. So I think we are at the stage in Canada that we should partner with them, not really confront them, and try to move our agenda further. And I think that's kind of comment that came up from Elizabeth this morning, and I would like to get comments from the entire panel, particularly Renée. Thank you.
Merci. Je vais prendre une deuxième question avant de pouvoir donner la parole aux panélistes. Oui, ça va.
Merci. Tom Cullen, Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm a volunteer there. I'm reminded of Thomas Homer Dixon saying, it's difficult to get the behavior you want when the economic signals are diametrically opposed from the financial signals. I'm wondering, the same way I can go to Staples and buy a box of SFC paper versus another box of paper for maybe a few dollars less, will I be able to go to an Esso gas station with one pump that says ethical oil and another one that says tar sands oil? I'm being a little provocative, but I'm wondering, is there actually a role? And factor into that as well the comment that one of the other panelists said earlier today, that most major companies are using a shadow price for carbon already in their project planning. And we're talking Exxon, Imperial, or whatever. So is there a glimmer of hope down there for an ethical oil?
À vous les panélistes, qui veut? Monsieur Denton.
One of the things that has bothered me about the sustainability discussion all along is the emphasis on economy. Because we have to step back and think what that means. I think I referred to the fact that we are debating whether or not we can afford to live in the future planet that will confront us. To anyone outside listening to that statement, they would think I was a lunatic. What does afford mean? If I have the only jug of water in here, and if you don't get it, you're dead, you will give me everything you have for that jug. So when we look at economics, that's really the base of what we have to consider. What is it worth to us to have a future at all? What is it worth to us if we're willing to spend $30,000 a year on hockey lessons for little Johnny? What happens if little Johnny grows up in a world without ice, or faces a future in which his children will choke and die in front of him? And what's the cost then that we have to consider? So when we use economics or even use the word, it's a smokescreen for other things that are going on. I think we need to identify we are looking at real cost accounting, what are the actual costs, and then think about what are the drivers. I didn't agree with the panelists this morning that talked about how the driver of all things is going to be, well, the financial side, the environment comes next, because I don't think that is a realistic assessment of how people actually make choices. We don't make choices only on the basis of what we can afford. Otherwise, none of us would be in debt, right? We make choices on the basis of what we want. And if we can reframe the question in such a way that we're looking at what we want, it's amazing the money that is there for what we want. I'm a historian of technology. Look back in the history of Canada and how we have gone ahead and built things that were I to propose them today, I would be regarded as a lunatic for that too. But much smaller population base with way less money managed to do things like put a railroad across the country. So the money is there should we choose it. The problem is the choice.
I'd like to maybe look at a different way in terms of the economics. There's actually a fantastic foundation. It's called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and it is working on the circular economy. And what they're proving is, in fact, that you don't have to lose profit to do the right thing. It's just it turns more into a natural design process, using the materials, designing in such a way that is effective, so hence resource efficiency. It looks at the natural and the technical side of things. Anyways, so look up the Ellen MacArthur circular economy. And I think that alleviates an awful lot of concerns to a lot of organizations. It's actually becoming the go-to model for the large corporations. So corporations are doing it. So, if one can do it, the other ones can.
Let's add just from our experience as an environmental organization. Capitalist system is really good at allocating scarce resources to maximize profit. It's very, very wonderful at that. But someone needs to be guiding it, and that's where the decisions, the active decisions that we make as a society and how we express them through regulatory guidance, et cetera, we need to recognize that. No one would say that a Ferrari isn't a great fast car, but no one would send it down the road without a driver. And around addressing climate change or other environmental and social factors, those things need to be priced into the system, and we've been terrible at that. I actually think that you're never going to solve all of society's needs by tinkering with taxation and pricing around how economic systems work. But we haven't even really tried on systems to date in Canada. You think of how we do not price in any way either the stuff that we dump into the environment or how we change the environment. There's a huge amount of space there to create greater efficiencies, to incorporate the costs of production into the stuff that we produce. It's not just carbon taxes, it's pollution taxes overall. And before we sort of say that it can't work, we should at least try it.
Monsieur Drolet, rapidement.
Yeah, very quickly. Someone asked if there is hope because some CEOs some companies already use a shadow price on carbon. I think there is hope, and I think that a lot of the players in the private sector get it. They get it much more than some of our government leaders. What's needed is maybe a change of perception, and if we move ahead with some policies like carbon pricing, some of these, especially some of the oil companies, may realize that yes, right now they are in the business of oil and gas, but in fact they are in the business of energy, and some of them have started to invest in renewables as well. So that will help doing this. But first of all, the government needs to recognize that jobs and prosperity can come with other, with clean energy as well. So that's, I think there is hope, but there is a lot to do.
Merci. Il y a deux dernières questions. On va devoir être très rapide, en fait, parce qu'il est déjà 15. Donc, si vous êtes capable d'être très, très, très rapide, Puis on va laisser les panélistes après pour la pause et le dernier panel.
Okay. Hello, my name is Camille Shadirji. I am a third-year student at Carleton University, and I was just wondering if Project 2030 will stimulate scientific research and in what capacity?
Je vais juste prendre l'autre question avant.
Hi, my name is Fabio Cicoira. I'm faculty at Polytechnique Montreal. Actually, my question is very similar. I think you agree that we need to have strong, to develop strong, clean technology. We need a huge investment in research. Is our country well equipped for that? And another thing, we also need to create among students the consciousness that they can find jobs in clean economy, because most of them, they want to go to oil sands industry because they pay well. Thank you.
Rapidement, les panélistes, le dernier mot. Le micro.
The seed to Mission 2030 was actually a research project on drywall recycling. By the way, I never intended to take on a global initiative. It started by wanting to ban drywall from Ottawa landfill, and that's how it started. And then it blew, and now it is actually an initiative that is recognized under the UNEP 10-year framework program that came out of Rio Plus 20. So we're really, really proud of that, and we are increasingly working with universities on research projects. So we're really proud of that. Thank you.
Ben, oui, c'était très rapide. Merci. Alors, merci, M. Drolet, M. Denton, Mme Gratton, M. Gray. C'était fantastique de vous avoir. Là, il y a toujours une question de temps. Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous d'être encore là. Il reste encore un panel. Ne quittez pas. Vous pouvez maintenant disposer